Hello family, how you doing? It's good to be with the community again. Wanted to talk about the Juneteenth holiday, which was just legislated into law this week. Um, there's a few problems with it. There's nothing wrong with honoring the end of chattel slavery. But we can't forget we're still in our captivity. And by that I mean the 13th Amendment still allows for slavery if you are in the penal system. You can still be forced slave labor. So that's, we'll get into the 13th Amendment in a minute. But anyway, what happened was June 19th, 1865. Let's remember the Civil War ended in Virginia, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, in April 9th, 1865. Lincoln was shot at the Forbes Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14th, the night of April 14th, 1865. He died after midnight across the street at a boarding house where they took him, so on April 15th, 1865. The war was over, but the northern troops hadn't got to Texas yet, and they did so on June 19th, 1865. General Granger went into Galveston and announced to Texas and people there that the war was over and they were forced to give up their slaves. Now, that was fine for Texas, and that was the end of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's what we want to get to. The North was losing the war in 1862, and January 1st, 1863, Lincoln did two things. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was written and drafted in the summer of 1862, when he also decided to let black freedmen or freed slaves, or even blacks from the North, so-called blacks, enter the Union Army. At the end of the war, the Confederate hierarchy and their government and their military said, this is not my opinion, 99 years before I was born, they said, if it wasn't for the black soldiers, America would have lost the Civil War. That's what the enemy said, who hated black people, who enslaved them. But they admitted that. So what Lincoln did, he said, we're going to have this proclamation, free all the slaves and conquer Confederate territory. Not in the United States, and conquer Confederate territory, because the cotton trade is the way in which the South would finance their military effort against America. So he wanted to cripple their ability to put an army in the field or a navy in the sea. So that's what he did. He did not free the slaves. They didn't include Tennessee because the Union Army had already occupied that at the time. And it didn't include the four border states who were slave states that fought on the side of the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, when the war ended, and then General Granger came to Galveston, Texas, the same place, 23 years later, I believe it was, in 1878, where, I'm sorry, 12 years later, rather, in 1878, where Jack Johnson was born in Galveston, Texas. So, son of slaves. So the point being, when the slaves were freed in Texas, there were still over 200,000, 225,000 slaves in the states of Kentucky and in Delaware. So these states weren't forced to give up their slaves. See, the southern states gave up their slaves at the point of a gun. The army had to come into your area, go to your plantation, and force you to do this. Why? Because this edict did not affect, it was for a foreign country. The South started their own country, the Confederate States of America. Lincoln had no jurisdiction. So the only way he could enforce his emancipation was through the army at the barrel of a gun. And that's why Texas didn't do it till after the war was over, when they physically got there. But the four border states, they didn't have to surrender their slaves. In fact, the governors of two of those states, Missouri and Maryland, started to free slaves in 1863. But by 1865, they were still states in Kentucky, where Lincoln was from, where his first wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, her father and brothers were officers in the rebel army, so that they can keep their slaves, even though their state, Kentucky, was on the side of America, and they were related to the First Lady of the land. You don't see that every day. And of course, in Joe Biden's Delaware, that was the first state in the Union, and it was the last state to give up their slaves. They gave up their slaves on December 6, 1865. This was about 8 months since Lincoln was dead in the grave, and it was a few months after July. So what we find here is Lincoln only freed the slaves in the South and conquered Confederate territories, and it was an economic ploy. He didn't give a damn about black people. And then the 13th Amendment passed by Congress is what freed the slaves in the 4 border states. And remember, the only person to this day to ever get compensation for slavery were the slave owners in those 4 border states. They got compensated for setting their slaves free. This is what happened. And we should be celebrating December 6th because none of us are free till all of us are free. And the last of us to walk off the plantation was December 6th of 1865, not June 19th. That's the last of the Confederate form of Confederacy to be forced to give up their slaves. So when they give that a holiday, it's like blaming the South for slavery. But America still has slaves months later. And then to not give that any homage or a holiday, that's almost, that's a revisionist of history. Now, the second thing is they shouldn't be giving us a holiday. I mean, that's fine, but we need resources. We need capital. That's what we need in form of reparations, not some money they're going to give everybody who's just going to run and give it right back to them to buying silliness and nonsense they don't need, or maybe a property that's made devalued. No, we need resources. That's what we need. We need capital. We need land, the kind of things we were promised. Remember when they defeated the Lakota people after the Civil War, and during the Civil War, who people called the Sioux from Wisconsin and Washington State, they gave all that land to immigrants from Germany and Scandinavia, people half of which couldn't even find America on the map during the Civil War. But according to the enemy, the black soldiers saved this country. So that's a reason we should be compensated, and we should be compensated in terms of resources, land. We shouldn't be compensated in terms of individually. That would be what I would say about that. And lastly, we should change this holiday to December 6th, because if we don't, we're not honoring, we're not paying any tribute to, and the people who died were terrorized, raped, murdered, and forced labored from June 19th to December 6, 1865, did so in vain if we don't honor their memory. That's what we have to do, and then not forget that we're still in the land of our captivity, and we're not in chattel slavery anymore, but it's a different form of slavery because the 13th Amendment, lastly, ratified on December 6, 1865. The state of Delaware didn't ratify it as a state for 35 years more in February 1901. That's how racist this place was. Mississippi didn't ratify it till after the year 2000. So I'll see you family next time. Remember, let's work on changing this date from June 19th to the date we all should be celebrating, December 6, 1865. Take care.